everybody. Welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. It is me and Nate and a special guest from the Trillbillies, Tarence Ray, our other Midwest. Well, we already discussed this. He's not in the Midwest, but our other flyover state lefty connection. Tarence, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm pretty good. How are you guys doing?
We're doing great. So we've got a couple of things that we wanted to go over here. Nate, did you want to introduce the topics here?
Yeah, for sure. So Terrence, I reached out to want to talk to you because your article that was titled "Hollowed Out" in the Baffler, talking about. Correct me if this is not the fair summation of the article, but basically sort of the way that revitalization projects and the whole concept of revitalizing Appalachia is more oriented around trying to make sure that Appalachians are useful to capital. And it seems to be like a circular exercise in giving management consultants jobs and nothing else.
That's very accurate, Nate.
Well, shit. There we go. Hell yeah.
So thanks for joining us, everybody.
Yeah, there you go.
So I was wondering if you want to talk maybe a little bit about sort of what brought you to write about that, and then I've got a couple of questions about some really what I find humorous but also very sad details in the article that I thought maybe we could talk about in at greater length.
Yeah. So there's a few reasons why I wrote it. Maybe the most obvious reason is that I used to work in nonprofits, so I used to more or less do the very thing I'm criticizing in the article. In Appalachia, there is a very large, well, I don't know, I guess it's probably not huge. It's obviously not bigger than the coal industry, but it's sizable. There is a sizable nonprofit industry. And part of the reason why I was writing that article is because there actually hasn't been a whole lot written about this. There's not been a whole lot written about the sort of like political economy of nonprofits, and more largely about the sort of, I don't know, approach to economic development from the direction of NGOs. There's obviously been things written here and there, like there's the book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. It's about the sort of nonprofit industrial complex. But in terms of Appalachia, it's not really been written about that much. And so I kind of wanted to just write a little bit of a history about that and track how we got here from the 1960s war on poverty up until now. Because as I said, there's not been a whole lot written about it, and partially that's because in Appalachia where we live, it's really hard to articulate this, but the sort of left, I guess the leftists, most of them are in the nonprofits. And that makes our ability to see the sort of political economy of it a lot harder because, I don't know, we're entrenched in the status quo, in the continuation of this industry. And so it's hard for us to critique it clearly. And so that's one reason why I wrote it.
I was going to say, I thought that nonprofits were good and did good things for everybody. Are you telling me that I have been lied to my entire life here?
Well, so I'll say this. And I explored this in another essay that I wrote around this time last year for Popula, for the website Popula. The whole point of nonprofits, the function and role they serve in American society, is to manage the contradictions of capitalism. We know that capitalism is a very imperfect system with many contradictions that will eventually maybe cause its own unraveling. But throughout the 20th century, and my article is kind of getting at this, the government played the largest role in managing capitalism's contradictions. Well, in the sort of neoliberal era, that role has more or less been transferred to the NGOs and the nonprofits, and it's no more. I mean, I've never lived anywhere but the Southwest and here, so I can't say if this is what it's like everywhere or in every part of rural America, but it's highly concentrated here, and so it's not necessarily that nonprofits are good or bad. It's just that they serve a very distinct role in American political economy, and leftists need to understand what that role is if we're going to try to change things.
Something that struck me about your piece, you described you selected a number of these organizations that had applied for grants or receiving funding, and you selected 15, and of those 15, only one of them you really were able to have any kind of substantive conversation with. The rest were just sort of like roundabout email chains or just being evasive. Could you talk us through a little bit of that? Because that sounds to me like those folks were not expecting anyone to come knocking in any capacity, and it winds up being this, I don't know, I don't want to say house of cards, but it just seems kind of absurd that, like, at first scratching of the surface, it becomes obvious that none of these people were expecting to have to answer any questions about like efficacy or like results.
No, and I point to that in the article. Like, so what I was digging into was this program called the Power Program, the Power Initiative. And it was this program initiated under President Obama and administered by the Appalachian Regional Commission, which basically poured money into nonprofits, business incubators, local community colleges. And the whole sort of approach is this very neoliberal idea, we're going to create jobs. We're going to train miners how to code, except they're going to be underpaying jobs, and those miners aren't going to be able to get jobs anywhere. And so I selected 15 of them. The reason I selected those 15 was because they had gotten money longer than any of the other programs. They had been getting money for more than 2 years at this point. So, because the program's still relatively new, I kind of wanted to give everyone the benefit of the doubt and pick the ones that had gotten funding for the longest amount of time. But yeah, it was incredibly sort of Kafka-esque process trying to actually get someone to talk to me. Because there's not a whole lot of oversight in these programs, mostly because it relies on capitalism for its own sort of efficiency. And so the thinking is that if you just pour money into a project, it's going to create jobs because that's the way markets work. But I get at this in the piece, like, the whole point of this, I don't know, the whole program relies on capitalism to be efficient, but it kind of evades some of capitalism's thorniest contradictions. For example, proximity does matter if you're talking about commodity production. No one's going to transfer, even if we do live in a right to work state, no one's going to put their factory in Eastern Kentucky because it's so far away from most major transportation corridors in the country. And so, like, there's that stuff that just doesn't even really make sense on the face of it. But then there's the coding and the tech stuff where they want to turn East Kentucky into Silicon Holler.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that specifically because I was like, when I read that, I was like, I can only imagine what kind of reaction that must produce in you to hear somebody like very breathlessly describe how it's like, the Appalachia is going to become Silicon Valley. It's going to be Silicon Holler. This is going to happen somehow. And those steps are never fleshed out.
No. And in fact, if you look at, there was a really crazy story in the New York Times written by this guy, Campbell Robertson, where he looked at this program called, I think it was Mine for Minds or something. Mind Minds, one of the two. Where these tech people from Chicago basically got all this money from the ARC, the Appalachian Regional Commission, to teach miners how to code. And no one got hired afterwards, and they lived lavishly. They were traveling all over the place, while the people who were actually, ostensibly getting the training couldn't do anything with the skills they learned. And so the thing is, like, they want to reproduce Silicon Valley, but they want to make an even more exploitative version of it. Like, they want to pay the employees even worse than they would get paid in actual Silicon Valley, and and I don't know.
It seems like every 2 or 3 years, there's some breathless article that's written about in St. Louis. Like, St. Louis, it's a booming tech hub. We're going to be getting all these people. We're going to become the Silicon Valley of the Midwest. And they're like, look at all these things. We have, we're a good hub. We're in the middle of things where we have high-speed internet. We have fiber. It's like, look how great and wonderful it is. And like, when you dig into it, it's just like, what it comes down to is that nobody wants to pay San Francisco prices anymore. They don't want to pay to live out there, and they're just like, it fucking sucks, and it's really expensive. How do we save money? Let's go to the Midwest. There's plenty of small cities, and you could do this anywhere. You could come to St. Louis. You could go to Oklahoma City. You go, I'm sure there's a city in Nebraska somewhere that you could do this in, and it's a like, let's shift everything because it'll be cheaper, because we can pay them less because there's a lower standard of living, which makes sense. Land is cheaper, building stuff is cheaper, but it never really germinates because no one wants to fucking live here. Like, nobody wants to go. Like, Silicon Valley of Eastern Kentucky sounds great, except you're not going to get a bunch of Silicon Valley people to go live in Eastern Kentucky, and you're not going to create, like, you're not going to do, like, here's 6 months of learning Perl scripting. Like, there it is. Now we have Silicon Valley. Like, you don't have Google there. You don't have Amazon there. You don't have these large places that sink a lot of money into the local population by building these places up. And so what ends up happening is just like what you have. You have like a bunch of miners that learned how to code, and you say, cool, you know how to code, and your options are you can either not work because there's no coding jobs in Eastern Kentucky, or you fucking up and move and go live in California or a big city, which I know a lot of rural people. There's a reason they're rural. It's not because they're just like, I can't figure out how to live in the big city. It's they don't want to fucking live in the big city, and I get that. So you've got like, and honestly, if you did inject all of this massive amounts of capital into these areas, all you're going to do is create a world where these people can't live anyway. Like in St. Louis, the big thing right now is the government is building a huge, like they've got a huge chunk of land in North City, which is our, quote, bad part of town. They're building a huge facility out there because it's cheap. Again, though, St. Louis is a good place to drop something. We have a lot of like really, big federal agencies here. But what does it do? Like, they're like, oh, it's going to really improve the area. It's like, no, it's going to push the poor people out again. Like, that's all that any of this ever is. It's like, let's plant the seeds on how to fuck over poor people that live in this area so that we can make it into something that we want. And like, thank God nobody ever like really pushes the investment for it, because otherwise you could make this St. Louis into a new Silicon Valley. You could do something like that maybe in Eastern Kentucky, but like the amount of money that you have to like push into something like that, one, for the infrastructure, two, as you said, you're not near a hub, so to build it up to be a hub is going to take a massive amount of capital, a massive amount of investment, and we're talking 10 to 15 years of building something up, and it's just never going to happen. So what you have is, rather than spend X billion amount of dollars to create something like this, it's let's spend X million of dollars that we can grift off the top, and we trained these guys. Yeah. We trained these guys. So now you're coders, and me as the middleman who takes the money and funnels it out to all these places. I get to make $120,000 a year, and I get to fuck off and go do it somewhere else. Like, that's what it always seems to me.
I think like what was so surreal to me looking into all of these grants, these power projects and grants, was the amount of, so you mentioned infrastructure, you mentioned like, if you want to actually try this, you're going to need the infrastructure. Well, like we live in I think Kentucky is, statistically one of the most not online states. We're very much not online here because our internet's so bad. We have very slow internet. And so if you were really going to replicate something like this, you'd need some sort of high-speed broadband throughout Eastern Kentucky. Well, we don't have that. And so it's interesting, though, to see all these grants and projects, and they're all about feasibility studies. And the thing about a feasibility study is, you get this money, and then you go out to a contractor, some consultants, and then from Louisville or something, and you give them, $250,000 to do a feasibility study to see if it's profitable to put internet in Eastern Kentucky. But I guess what was so surreal to me about it and absurd is like looking at all this stuff about feasibility studies, about infrastructure, when you just can't build the infrastructure. Like, there was nothing in any of these projects for actual infrastructure. Like, I think out of over 100 projects, I think I only saw 2 for water and sewer infrastructure. I mean, like, none of this is actually helping anybody. It's just a way to spread a little bit of money around this sort of I know this is a controversial term this week, but the sort of professional managerial classes and the bourgeois classes who can, set up shop in a eastern Kentucky town for 6 months and then let their business go under and not pay anybody shit and then just bounce, which I've seen over and over again. So yeah, basically it's a scam in some ways, but there's people who actually believe it. There's people who actually buy into the ideology of it. And that's what's really so confounding to me. I know this is probably obvious to you two and to most of the audience, but this isn't politics. But there's a lot of people here who think that it is. They think that this is, and this is partially because the only economy here for so long was coal. And so by virtue of being not pro-coal, people think that it has some sort of progressive dimension to it or that it's in some way liberatory, but it's not. This is just another handout for capitalists, and it's another way to exploit our labor as cheaply as possible.
I was going to, because there's a passage in your piece that really struck me because it definitely kind of gets to, in my opinion, to the heart of this idea that all of this is oriented around either disciplining workers or kind of putting on a display. And I was going to read this as an encouragement, A, to talk about it, but B, as an encouragement for our readers to go out and actually read your piece in its entirety. So you write, all of this is to say that we can identify several themes in the Obama administration's Grand Appalachian Economic Development Initiative. First, never meet people's material needs directly or encourage them to organize. Rather, study the feasibility of giving them things or throw some money at a community college, which can train people in the art of being a well-behaved and productive worker so that they can then get things themselves. Second, if you absolutely must build any infrastructure, make sure it's in service to something else, like a wildlife viewing facility or a prison. Third, use as many fancy words as possible to make it sound like you're keeping busy. Target and deploy your dislocated coal workers to maximize creative potential so that we can create a thriving and diverse restorative economy in the mountains. Yeah. So just as a side note to this, I'm from central Indiana, but my parents now live in southern Indiana, and where they lived, basically there was auto parts manufacturing and stone cutting for limestone, and some of the stone cutting is still around. All the auto parts factories moved to Mexico and have now moved elsewhere, and having grown up in Indianapolis and then now going there when I visit my parents, I realized just how much basically that sector of the economy has been abandoned, that these people, because they're not useful to anyone, the basically the kind of natural order of things assumes that the best they can hope for is to work at Walmart and nothing else is going to change about it.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in it because I realize that the approach that's taken in a sort of like J.D. Vance style, let's save Appalachia kind of thing, is no different than the extremely always pro-business approach that the state of Indiana takes, which is to say, don't actually get to the heart of the problem, just talk about something that sounds buzzy.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, you know this from the inside as from working in NGOs, but also from researching this. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on like what does meeting people's needs actually look like as opposed to all of this, which clearly isn't doing anything.
Yeah, it's a hard question because obviously there's the obvious answers, which is healthcare. The biggest employer in our county right now is healthcare. It's one of the biggest employers in the state, and there's stuff that like Medicare for all, which is just basically the government guaranteeing a health plan, would be a huge boon for this area. So I guess it's several different levels, right? The first is that you can meet materials needs from a sort of social democratic perspective. You can give them, welfare benefits, health benefits. You can actually build up their infrastructure and give them housing, clean needle exchanges, rehab centers, stuff that aren't prisons and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is the second level, which is that if we are still talking about having a sort of robust society and economy. Personally, I would like to see one that's not capitalistic, but more communistic. You're going to need resources. We still have a lot of resources here. We still have coal and we still have timber. Those are the biggest ones. And so I don't know. I'm not really sure how this shakes out. I'm not a scholar of the Soviet Union, so I don't know how you actually extract resources in a way that's like woke.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's something that we should be thinking about. The thing that I've discovered over the years is that the left doesn't have a really good answer to what to do with rural America. And this is not our generation's fault. The left has struggled with this for 150 years, going back to Marx. And that's because if you have a rural peasantry that is mostly sort of self-sufficient or self-contained, how do you link them up into any sort of like larger proletarian movement? Well, it's, Marx referred to the rural peasantry famously as the sack of potatoes. Like they're bundled together, but they're not, their labor and social relations aren't bound up one with another. So I don't know. I think that the left is still trying to figure out what it looks like to actually meet material needs of rural people. Personally, I struggle with it a lot because I don't consider myself what you would call a social democrat, but I do think that if you, that's the bare minimum you have to do: infrastructure, healthcare, stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to me that if you go to rural, like I go down to Texas County, Missouri, where I've got a lot of family down in Kabul and Mountain Grove and areas like that. You can't mention words like communism. You can't mention words like socialism because they're obviously verboten down there. But you do see how these communities are communistic, like as in a commune, as in people, a small town of 2,000 people who they all take care of each other. Where there's not, where like even my aunt had a couple of transient homeless people living on her property, and she took care of them. And if it was really bad weather outside, she let them come in, and she had a very nice basement. With a room set up down there, and it's like, oh yeah, just why don't you guys come in? We'll help take care of you, because she's been a teacher, a public school teacher, down in these areas. She knows people need help, and she's a very good Catholic woman too, who takes care of people. In any way, but
and yet you can't talk to those people about communism, which is always a surprise to me.
You can't talk to her about being a Democrat. She hates Democrats because it's a handout. Because a lot of people in these areas think, well, I don't want something to come from the government if there's going to be some kind of thing in which it should be all of us all of us come together to help out the people who need help, which is like. That's fine, but what do you think the government is other than a centralized thing that can, manage and put out the resources properly? Now, don't get me wrong. I am a veteran and I am a leftist, and I do not trust the government one bit to ever do anything.
Well, no, I mean, I was thinking about us getting all these fucking vaccinations that they later just like, oh yeah, by the way, you might get cancer from those things,
but you won't get
might
anthrax.
Have kids with birth defects. I won't get anthrax, and I won't get smallpox because I'm like, people my parents' age had to have smallpox inoculations, but like no one my age did unless they joined the army. In which case, yeah, now we've got them. But yeah, I mean, that always blows my mind too, Francis. And I didn't mean to cut you off there, but yeah, like the idea that it conceptually this stuff shouldn't be that difficult and it shouldn't be so anathema, but it winds up being a difficult thing to talk about because you've got a very kind of ingrained fear or dislike of stuff that for all intents and purposes is a larger and more organized version of what you're already describing going on there.
Sure.
Like, imagine if you didn't have to house these people in your basement because they had housing that was guaranteed to them. Like, it's not that hard of a leap, and yet... And
that's always you talk to these people and you say, well, what resources would you need? Like, well, we need better things for, like, people who have addiction, because addiction, obviously, opioid and methamphetamines are big problems in rural areas. We need better healthcare. We don't have, there's not a hospital where they live. They have to, drive 20 minutes to go to a decent hospital. It's like, what... And the really big answer, the answer to the easy fix is like, well, we just take all the rural people and we put them in the city, and then you're near everything. But they don't want to come near. They don't want to come to the city. So we need to take the resources and put them out there for the people out there. And it's like,
I'm just laughing at the idea that like you're like, hey, you know what? These people are a little bit worried about social democracy, so let's do like Stalinist population transfers and forcibly relocate all of them.
Pol Pot did that.
I'm SpongeBob memeing them, where we take all the rural people and we put them in a suburb somewhere out. So we put them in St. Charles, Missouri, right outside, where they can still be, still very white, and they can, be comfortable there. But that is. These are the problems that come up, and it's like, well, what do you need? Well, you know who you get those from? You get those from the government. If we, bolstered these things up, and I think that's why there is inherently a huge mistrust in rural areas, not just for the Democratic Party, but for government in general, because it's not so much I don't want help from you. It's you've never given me help to begin with. Why would I ask you for it now? And when you do help me, it fucks me over. Like, does anybody think that, like, if you go, like, Tarence, as you were talking, these miners who go and they learn how to code and now they don't have jobs, what is going to be when you say, well, we've got another idea for you, and whether it's going to be private industry or whether it's going to be government to come in, and they say, well, we've got another idea, do you think they're probably just going to tell you to fuck off because you wasted my time, you did something which I can't use, and you're still taking away the thing that I can do, which is coal mining? And like the easy thing to do is like, hey, we still need energy. What can we do out here and make kind of a basic job training off of that, which I know is like something that Bernie Sanders has talked about. I am all for getting rid of the healthcare industry, and then you get people saying, well, there's 40,000 people that work in healthcare. What are you going to do? You're just going to kick those people out of a job. It's like, look, if we abolish healthcare, the health industry, or at least cut it down to like, a fraction of what it is now, you take those people and you say, hey, you guys are really good at red tape. Let me give you a government job. Because guess what? We got a shitload of in the government, a lot of red tape, a lot of paperwork that needs to be filled out. Come on over. We'll get you taken care of. So, I feel like, the idea is correct. Let's go into the rural areas, let's build these places up, and let's, retrain the people. But the problem is that you have capitalists that go in there, and it's not about how do I make things better for you? It's how do I make things better for me using you?
Yeah.
And that's
how
where
do you
it
become
all,
useful to me? Yeah.
Exactly. And that's where it all fucking falls apart. And then again, you have this just constant thing that's feeding into itself where like somebody comes in and you're going to have the rural people say, go fuck yourselves.
Yeah, well, the government tried to do this. There was two huge initiatives wherein the government tried to basically sort of build up rural America. I mean, the biggest one was the New Deal, obviously, and it got a lot of support in a lot of rural places. There's a place so I'm from Southeast New Mexico, but there's a New Deal, Texas, just over the border. The New Deal was huge in West Texas. And then the second big one was the war on poverty in the 60s. And the whole reason for that was Lyndon Johnson grew up in, extreme poverty in Central Texas without electricity or running water. And that was partially why he wanted to, pour more infrastructure and resources into rural America. The thing that's happened in the last 40 years is that, as you're saying, yeah, the Democrats have totally vacated that role. And they've turned over the only organizing force in rural America to the corporations, not just any corporations, but the extractive ones, the ones that, get the resources. Because here's the thing, and again, this is why I don't think leftists have really fully grappled with what we mean when we talk about it. It's because, like, what is rural America? It's where the resources are, and I mean raw materials. It's like, all of our raw materials come from what we call rural America. We don't get coal and timber from the cities. We don't get oil and gas from St. Louis or New York City. We get it from the rural parts of the country. And so the politics of those places have to reflect that, and they have to reflect the continued extraction of those resources uninterrupted. And so part of what I'm driving at in this essay, and what I'm driving at here, is that there's a lot of places in those rural parts of the country that look though just like everywhere else. They're still an employer, and they're still employees that make profit for the employer. And so really what I was driving at and what I've been driving at in multiple essays, for the past year is that if you're actually trying to change things in rural America and you're trying to build a broad-based movement that can, say plug into the Bernie Sanders campaign, you're going to need to organize workers along sort of traditional union lines. There's still people, there's people that work at my McDonald's that have worked there for over a decade. Those are long-term jobs for a lot of people in rural places, at all in the service industry itself mostly. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if you're actually trying to change things, like the solutions are political, you have to organize those people. You can't, get a bunch of money from the government and say you're going to set up shop and train coal miners to code, because it's unrealistic for multiple reasons that we've already covered now. But the second thing is, like we were saying, it's not politics. No one is liberated from that. No one is actually... they're not banding their labor power together and organizing and engaging in class struggle. And this is the big thing. It's the thing that I think we've been trying to hammer home since we started the podcast, is that it's all class warfare. And, using NGOs to sort of address it is not going to do it.
It's as you said, that resources come from rural America. Like, rural America really, if it banded together, would hold a stranglehold over the country easily. Like, no, I'm not sending you guys any more coal. No, I'm not sending you guys any more food. No, I'm not sending you guys any of this stuff.
This is what worries me about the Green New Deal. It really does, because for it to work, you need to organize the extractive industries. And I've lived my whole life in proximity to them, and can just tell you, I don't know any socialist oil rig hands, or coal miners or pipeliners. And so, for it to actually work without some sort of like French Revolution, Vendée uprising in the rural areas, you're going to need the extractive industry unions to be on board. And so,
I was thinking about that. In fact, the people that I know that have worked in like the oil patch in North Dakota and stuff, a lot of them have come out of it kind of getting radicalized towards like fucking far right stuff.
Yeah.
Because they've become like they for one, they sort of became this like, I'm a self-made man, and then when oil prices dropped and they lost their jobs, all of a sudden they lost that quality of life that they were expecting, and had to either move or go work someplace else, work overseas or something like that. And it's weird how it creates this. It's like they're shaped by their circumstances, but they're probably more amenable to a much more punitive and much more, like, for lack of better terms, sort of like Volkish kind of conception of things as opposed to solidarity. And I was thinking about that too, because I wanted to dovetail this into this discussion, talking about people being obligated to leave, because that was something you talked about in your piece, that as coal has the coal industry has decreased in this past decade, in the early part of this decade, the level of outmigration from Appalachia has been massive. And one of the things that we know, that Francis and I know really well, is folks leaving by joining the military, because it's an option and it brings with it employment benefits that other places aren't going to offer you. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that maybe a little bit, about combating that, but then also the extent to which it seems that some of these solutions don't really address the fact that if folks want to earn a living outside of service jobs, like what you're describing, they basically are obligated to leave.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There, for the longest time, maybe in the second half of the 20th century, coal mining was the middle class job around here. It paid pretty well, and so if you didn't want to leave, you go work in coal mining or timber, or into a little bit lesser extent oil and gas. But just in the last 10 years, we have seen just a massive sort of wave of outmigration. And it's funny. It's like the only people who are really talking about it are people like Rand Paul, weirdly enough. Like, Rand Paul's solution for the longest time, which is weird because he's a libertarian, his solution was basically paying people to leave, paying people to dislocate and, I don't know, pick up bags and go work in an oil camp or something in North Dakota. And so, I don't know, that's kind of scary that the right is basically talking about it that way.
Well, you think about that Kevin Williamson essay from a few years back, where he basically ends it on, these people who were left behind when I think it was something like fiberglass industry collapsed in upstate New York. He basically was like, leave or die.
Yeah.
And it's like, Well, fuck.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound particularly positive.
No, that was literally, you're exactly right. That was his thesis. And so, yeah, and so you're right. So a lot of people join the military. I've had several friends who have taken that route, and it's, but it makes sense. I mean, seriously, it makes a lot of sense. Why would, if you wanted to get out, but you didn't have a whole lot of options, let's say you were poor, that your access into that sort of professional managerial class isn't going to help you. If you could move to a big city and work at, like, I don't know, McDonald's or something there, but like, let's say you're aspirational or like you have other skills, military is the best sort of stepping stone for that. There's all kinds of material forces that are, I don't know, pushing you into all kinds of directions, and I don't know. It's I don't know. I don't have much of an answer for it, but I think the thing is that I'm not sure that a lot of the left does at the moment. It's just not something we really talk about that much.
But I think about the Richard Jetta phenomenon, because here's this guy who's basically anti-managerial class, but posits himself as pro Bernie Sanders, pro teachers union strike, but also says, I voted for Donald Trump in 2016 because I thought he'd changed something.
Yeah,
and that's a weird. That seems like so, I don't know, like at odds with itself that it couldn't exist, and yet it does. And it seems like, to me, that plus, if I remember correctly, the extreme amounts of support for Sanders in the 2016 Democratic primary in West Virginia, and I'm homing in on West Virginia specifically just because of Jetta. It seems like that's indicative of, here's this state where the largest private employer is Walmart. Here's the state with tremendous problems with opiate addiction and overdoses, and here's this, the state where their Democratic Party apparently is not satisfied with, pie charts. And but it's a weird thing, and I'm wondering, do you think that that's kind of like something that could be gained through organizing, that people are amenable to that, or do you think that someone like Jetta is just sort of don't get me wrong, I'm not like he weirds me out and he strikes me as kind of an opportunist, but there's also an extent to which a guy like him who enlisted in the military, went to college, became an officer, and served out a full career until he got a retirement, and is now involved in politics. Like, he seems like he at least represents perhaps something closer to the experience of people around him than like a Pete Buttigieg character who, if you know anything about Indiana, you know about South Bend, his parents were both tenured professors at Notre Dame. Like, he's not salt of the earth in any capacity. I mean, like, but that's the thing. People hear Indiana and they assume it's like some kind of, I don't know, like hayseed caricature. It's like, no, we have cities. We have cities with universities in them. Like, yeah, they do exist.
Yeah, the thing is Jetta, I struggle with him because I struggle with trying to determine if, as you say, he is, authentic, or if he's more of an opportunist. Like, I guess I struggle with him because I wonder if he's just such a unique personality. Like, him saying he voted for Trump was antithetical in many ways to a lot of the policy positions he took up, because he's pro-labor. I think he's also like marijuana decriminalization and stuff like that. He has a weird
he's pro-gun control on the basis that guns kill cops. And I mean, like, he's not wrong, but it's a weird position to take. Like, I've just never seen it before.
Yeah, he's a very weird guy. The thing is I think we've criticized him before in the show, but I don't want to pick on just him. There's a lot of candidates like him that have tried to do the AOC thing and have failed. And so then a lot of people draw the conclusion like, oh, well, maybe it's not possible in rural America. Maybe you do have to give lip service to Trump to be able to win. Well, and I guess there's a few things there. It's the first would be like, well, Jetta did it and he still lost. So I don't know if that really matters. But I think if you look at a lot of these campaigns, or at least if you look at Jetta's and maybe Paula Jean Swearingen's, she is another one in West Virginia who was running in the southern part of the state. Jetta was in the more central part of the state, but both of them were running in coal country, more or less. If you look at their campaigns, I think they had a hard time they had a hard time winning, because the people who they would be trying to harness for their campaigns, and this is probably going to be the problem Bernie runs into, I don't know, are mostly people who don't vote. especially, and Bernie may not run into this because he's running in a high-profile presidential election. Jetta and Swearingen were running in House seats that nobody votes in. Poor people don't vote for fucking congressmen. And it's hard enough to get them to even be interested to come out to a rally. So I think it's sort of a structural problem that they run into every time. And so what they wind up doing is that then they have to sort of backtrack and then start chasing after the professional managerial classes or the middle class coal miners or whatever. And then once you get into that, you're splitting votes. Some of those are going to go over to Republicans. Some of them are going to go over to Democrats, but you're not going to get enough to win. And so it's kind of a structural issue that I think they run into. And I'm not really sure how you fix it. I hate to make any kind of generalization about whether it works or whether it doesn't work. This is the weird thing. It's like when you talk about like electoralism or electoral politics, people will point to an election and be like, see, it works. Or they'll point to one and say, see, it doesn't work. And it's the thing. It's like this country is so heterogeneous politically and economically that you can't make any generalization about it, across the board.
Yeah.
So I think a guy like Jetta could win. The thing is like, I don't know. I guess maybe people do kind of are a little wary of him. I'm not sure though. In his district, I don't know. Me personally, I was a little wary of him, but I can't really put my finger on why. So
I've run into more than one person who was I'm pro Bernie, but I voted for Trump because they don't like Hillary, and it's like I get that, and I understand. It's like kind of I hate Hillary, and I don't know what Trump will do, so let's just go with that. And we see what a mistake that is in general, but also, what would you have with Hillary other than the same thing but quieter, I guess, and maybe less people mad about the things, and that's probably about it. So.
Well, I know that we've had guests on this show before who are veterans who are working specifically like in the capacity of anti-war or at least like anti-Trump, anti-Republican politics, but in the capacity like they're representing themselves as veterans, and we've had people tell us that it's much easier to get your foot in the door with people who run campaigns or people who donate money and so along those lines now, because being anti-war means being anti-Trump's war. But when these same people were campaigning against militarism, under Obama, it was not particularly easy to get heard, and it's strange to me how that thing kind of changes. And I guess I bring that up because I'm interested in something you guys said on your most recent episode, Tarence. You guys were talking about how if you want socialist organizing and you want to build socialism in America, that taking on the carceral state is the most important thing. And I'm interested what you think about that in the capacity of also like the extent to which the military and if you want to call it the military industrial complex, especially in the capacity of like professional people who work in defense, there's a huge amount of vested class interest in what the military being funded and doing what it continues to do. How do you confront that? Both confronting, because I'll tell you this much. People talk about having like radicalization moments, and I definitely had a couple, but one of the worst ones for me was we got a recall notice saying, hey, you guys' helmets that you were wearing in Afghanistan were actually a faulty lot that were released, and we need to like recall them because the manufacturer, United Prison Industries, didn't follow the protocols. And I was like, wait a minute, you're telling me that the helmet I wore when I was on patrol in Afghanistan was made by prisoners in America?
Yeah. And
it's weird. Maybe it's cliche, but I had this like heart sink moment. I'm like, this is so fucked. I can't even believe it. And the stuff is tied together. And I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are. It's like combating. It's a huge question, and I realize it might not be something you can give like a neat answer to. But combating the carceral state in the capacity of also combating militarism, like, and also knowing that a lot of folks like Richard Jetta and people like that have their lives and their livelihoods vested in that.
Yeah. Well, I think that we say that it's because prisons, like the military or like empire, they really are the sort of most visible manifestation of the empire. We don't have an anti-war movement in this country like we used to. We don't talk about imperialism like we used to. But I think the reason that we sort of like pinpointed the carceral state as like the location for making an inroad there is because it is the location of. It's where all those contradictions rise to the surface. You've got slave labor making products for the empire and imperial ventures overseas, doing it in a way that is highly controlled and surveilled. There's certain books you can't read in prisons. You're in solitary confinement most of the day unless you're working. And not just that, there is an entirely other aspect to this. Have y'all seen that show? It's called Escape at Dannemora. You ever heard about it? It's prison in upstate New York.
I know the story, yeah, because I was living in New York when that happened, yeah.
Yeah, there was 2 guys who escaped. And you should watch this show because, weirdly enough, Ben Stiller directed it, which really blows my mind. But more than any other piece of art I've seen in like 20 years, it explores the political economy of a prison town. And it explores not just the slave labor dimension of a prison, but the fact that towns, all the social relations of a town can start to become internalized in the prison itself and interwoven with the social relations of the people in those prisons. And so what you wind up getting is you get something that, in my opinion, mirrors very much what it probably would have looked like in the 18th century or 19th century slave plantation.
Even to the point where literally those people are counted in the census. The prisoners are counted in the census for those districts, which were basically almost 201 Republican districts.
Exactly. And so, by doing that, by engaging in that and trying to sort of make inroads into it, not just is there like the whole radicalizing feature of it, it's that you're also building a sort of shared power analysis with other people. And we just don't talk about this enough. And this is, I think, from the beginning why maybe I've always been sort of skeptical of, I don't know, what you would call Bernie-style electoral politics. Even though I support him, I'm going to vote for him and going to tell everybody else to do so. It's just that the thing is that we have this massive empire, and it disheartens me to see sort of solutions on the table that don't sort of acknowledge that the whole nature of it is violence, and but not only that, it is very banal. It has a human face. And it is interwoven into all of our lives, and so I think that's why we sort of identified the carceral state as the location for that. It's like it is the place, like I said, where all those contradictions rise to the surface. Now, in terms of actually changing it or intervening in a way that could actually, I don't know, trigger some sort of upheaval in this country, I don't have any answers for that. I don't know what to do. I've been doing it for almost a decade now. And I still don't have any answers. And so, I don't know. That's the part that's hard. But, I think we just want to encourage everybody to, to look into it or at least be thinking about it.
I mean, I just remember this. Francis, before you tell your last thing, I was going to say, I just remember this from living in New York. And I was doing something at the post office one time, and a guy had just gotten out of prison, and he was in line in front of me, and he needed a money order because he needed cash, but he didn't have any ID because he'd just gotten out of prison, and what he had left over from when he had been imprisoned was just his prisoner ID, and the woman at the counter was like, I can't accept this to cash this money order. And you could tell this guy was like, I mean, he was desperate, and somebody in the line behind him was like, hey man, I'll get the money order for you, and we can take this sorted. But you realize this guy had just been put out on the street with no ability to survive in any capacity, no ability to like make sense of his surroundings or like to get into a place where he wouldn't necessarily be exposed because that didn't matter. What matters is this person filling a cell? Is this person counted in a census? Is this person making uniforms or like drinking straws for whatever the Unicor or whatever these fucking things are that the companies that do this stuff? And it's crazy to me when I think about seeing that. You forget that you want to believe that these things, because you're sold this fiction that they're humane and they're places of last resort. And it's like, no, they're absolutely not. And in fact, what winds up happening is prisoners are just integrated in the economy to the point where, like you guys described on your show, it's like, oh, imagine this place used to be a slave plantation when they're doing a news thing at Angola, and it's like there's literally people in the background picking fucking cotton because they're being made to work in a prison.
Right, exactly.
We actually have a big push right now. Ever since the Ferguson protests, there has been, and there still is, a big push to close a place called the Workhouse, which is up in northern North City, and it's so much that like fucking Ben and Jerry, the ice cream company, has puts out paid advertisements to close the Workhouse. Like it's to a and really the Workhouse is it's kind of like that. It's just like you get arrested, you can't post bail, so guess what? You're going to stay here for 9 months, and that's all it is. So you're going to lose your house, you're going to lose your car, you're going to lose your job, you're probably going to lose your family while you're in there. Like, because we had a guy who in my neighborhood would kind of come around, a guy named Lawrence, and he was kind of in and out of prison, but he always he came by and would offer to wash your car for we'd always give him a couple bucks to wash the car, to, detail the inside, and then he just disappeared one day. And come to find out, he had gotten picked up on a murder charge. And we're like, that's not Lawrence. Lawrence didn't kill anybody. Like, he was, he was in and out of jail for small petty burglary. He wasn't a murderer. And he was in the Workhouse for months waiting to be processed. And again, he's not convicted of anything. He is accused. And then it turned out that, a couple, somebody came and confessed the murder because his family was just there's somebody in jail for your crime right now. You need to go and fucking make it right. And so he ended up they're like, okay, you're released. But like you said, Nate, to fucking what? What did he have? He worked small jobs. He worked, he would detail your car if you knew him. But after, 5 to 6 months, I have no idea where he is. I have never seen him since then, other than knowing that he went to the Workhouse
I did not realize that they had pre-trial prison labor like that.
I don't know if
That's
there's
crazy.
Oh yeah. No, they do.
Yeah.
At our jail here, our county jail here, they do. It's crazy.
Absolutely.
That's insane. Wow.
And that's the thing is that it is St. Louis has always had a push against this kind of thing since 2014, where we're all people you get a ticket that you can't pay, and then it compounds and then you get a warrant put out for your arrest, and then you get picked up on a traffic violation, and then you go to jail. And you stay in jail because you can't pay your bail, because you can't pay the ticket. You couldn't pay the original fucking $30 ticket. You certainly can't pay the $500 ticket. Certainly can't pay the $1,000 worth of bail. But guess what? Now you can fucking make something in the Workhouse for us. And it's just it's incredible, and it's incredible that not only that we allow this to happen, but when you point that out to somebody and they're just well, you should have just done this or done that. It's it's never that simple. Shit, my wife got a parking ticket and then forgot about it. A $15 parking ticket turned into a $60 parking ticket. Now, we could take care of that, but what if you can't? Or what if you never did have that $15 and it wasn't even about, forgetting about the ticket? And that's how that shit happens. And it's just there, for the grace of God, I have the privilege to have $60 and say, "Oh shit, let's go ahead and get this taken care of." And that's what it is, and that's where we are. So I am 100% behind the whole not only do we have to unfuck the carceral state, but we need to unfuck how we think about prisoners and understand. It's look, man, it's just like a homeless person or somebody on Skid Row. It's that's still a person, man. That was still a kid sometime. That was still somebody who probably watched Sesame Street and ate Cheerios and fucking laughed at dumb jokes and stuff like that. And just because they're their life is fucked up doesn't mean that we should be doing that.
Yeah. And the thing is, the reason I say start pivoting our attention or orientation to it is because eventually those people revolt. People in situations like that are going back for millennia always revolt. I mean, you can't say when or how, and you can't control it generally. That's just the way dissent usually works, or insurrection usually works. The problem of the left is how integrated into those communities are we going to be when they do revolt? And can we exert any kind of influence to steer them in a revolutionary left position or direction? And so that to me is the biggest argument for why it's important to be, because if not, what's going to happen? You're going to have like the yellow vest protest in France, which some of them were driven by leftists, but some of them were also driven by the right.
Oh, yeah, God, yeah. Some of them were like full on kick out, ban the Islamicization of France, whatever the fuck that means. Like they were pretty far right adjacent. Yeah.
No, well, now I was just going to say that they revolted for very real, even though some of them were right wing. They rioted and revolted for very real material concerns, and so it's like how are we going to respond to when that happens here? Because it will. I mean, it happened 6 years ago. I mean, when in Ferguson, you know what I mean? Like people forget we had weekly street insurrections in this country not even 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing. Like how embedded into those communities and movements are we?
So for this week's bonus, I've actually got an interview with John Motter, who's a Marine infantry veteran and an anti-war activist based in Los Angeles. And we spent an hour interview talking about what it's like organizing in LA, what it's like basically trying to organize for anti-military or anti-imperialist politics in the bigger context of a lot of leftist organizing. And also, John's got a background in film, and so we talk about why war movies, even if they're nominally meant to be anti-war, come across as being pro-war. So here's a preview of that, and you can get the full thing on Patreon.
I mean, I'd be lying if I said like I haven't seen any progress, but it is extremely frustrating, like how it's not a priority. It's not like the other things don't matter, but the fact that no one's even making that connection, like we just spend so much time hammering on and on about like the military industrial complex and like how intersectional it is and how like you can't really address these other issues without addressing it. And like still like these people who will like go online and, maybe talk a big game about like imperialism, like can't be bothered to like show up to a meeting about this or an event or incorporate anti-militarist language into their own organizing, which is like kind of like all we're asking for at this point is just.
Yeah. I was just thinking about, like, recently there was an announcement, I think it was like a Stars and Stripes or a military.com story about how recruiting, the number one or a significant cause in terms of like what people reported as like why they were enlisting was because of either student loan or medical debt.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you can't see that, the current neoliberal state of affairs and the way in which everything is priced out and everything is made into like a route to debt is driving people into a kind of like, I don't know, acquiescence to the military industrial complex. Like, obviously those two are related. And surely the people who are profiting from the military and militarism and imperialism aren't going to want that recruitment pipeline to go away, by way of things like free trade school, free college, free healthcare on demand, stuff like that. But it's hard sometimes to get people to acknowledge that because there is, in my opinion, there is a line that some people will take where it's like, oh, well, people who join the military, like you don't want to try to reach them because they've already been radicalized by the right. And it's like, maybe, but also maybe just they're looking for a steady paycheck and like a way to pay their loans or a job. And those causes, like you said, are intersectional. And it's like, I struggle with that too sometimes, because it's not to say, all right, this thing that we're organizing where we're trying to push for single payer healthcare has to now go away because it's all anti-war activism. But it's more like you said, bringing it into the same framework, that this is an issue that is basically profiting from or being made worse by the fact that there's a pipeline to get people to be bodies in uniform.
Yeah, I think that just comes from a like complete lack of understanding of intersectionality, which is a result of, not really showing up for anyone except yourself and like the issues you care for. I was just talking about this last night, like how great of an organizing community we have here in LA, even though it's, much smaller than I would like it to be. But like we all know each other because we're all showing up for each other. We each have like our specific focuses, But when the call goes out, when we have a campaign, like, we're there for each other. We're always like, I had this art event last night in a park. It was for About Face, and we were having dinner in the park. And while we're having dinner there, I mean, this was like more, we were kind of representatives there to, talk about the war and stuff like that. It was a Jewish Iraqi artist, Michael, God, I'm going to mess up his last name, Rabowitz, I think. And it was, we had no idea, like, the people showing up, like, the invites kind of went out to, I think, his community. But while we're there, I could hear the cops on the other side of the park, like, ordering people to leave and that they were breaking the law. And I just had to, like, make an announcement that, like, there right then. It's like, okay, yeah, we're all here gathered. We're going to have, like, a nice dinner. But, like, right now, like, 100 meters away, maybe, like, the most murderous police force in the country is ordering some unhoused person to leave this park. And, like, I got really pissed that was happening even. And just, so the intersection's right there of, it's just, like, so clear to me, like, how LAPD and police intersect with the military and the military industrial complex, and how now our own communities are being, like, further militarized, and how, like, our city right here is being treated as, like, an occupation zone, and, like, people have a curfew and are being, like, ordered to leave under, like, penalty of death or incarceration. And if folks, like, did just, like, make a bit of effort to show up for other groups, like okay, like, your big focus is on Medicare for all, maybe you have, like, a lot of personal reasons for doing that, and that's great, and, like, we need that. But, like, when Black Lives Matter say, like, hey, we got an action, we need allies to show up, like, show up and support them. And then you'll realize that, getting shot by the police is, like, really bad healthcare. You're like, that's really bad for your health. And all, like, and how I was talking about this too, about, all these mothers and family members who show up at BLM actions, and they're just so traumatized, and it's just something, like, you can't get over, and they're crying, like, every week at these protests. We've been doing these protests outside the DA's office for 2 years now, and these mothers don't get trauma counseling. They don't get counseling for, like, their kids who were murdered, sometimes right in front of them. But the cops who did it do. And it's just, like, completely absurd that they have to, like, they can't afford, therapy, but they just have to endure this, like, basically for the rest of their lives. And, like, I don't know if that's really getting, if that's getting talked about when we talk about healthcare and stuff like that. So,
or PTSD for that matter.
Yeah. PTSD. Absolutely. I mean, the PTSD rates in, parts of the city here are higher than in some war zones. So, I mean, there's broader points, like, about funding, of course, like, we can't fund any of these things while we're funding war. But I don't really understand it from, like, a personal level. Like, every time, I mean, I'm sure you're the same. Like, I follow all, like, the local journalists and outlets on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. And so every day, like, literally every day, it's like, 10 Afghans killed in a suicide bombing, 30 pine nut farmers killed in a drone strike. That wedding that got massacred a couple weeks ago, that was in my AO. I'd been to that village, Kunjak.
Oh man.
And the fact that, like, other people, like, I organize with can see these things and just, like, not see that as a priority, that, like, we are actively, like, very violently murdering people every single day, and, like, we don't, that's just, like, not a priority to organize around, is, like, deeply frustrating. And the asks are, like, so small right now of other people to, like, I couldn't get people in my chapter to, like, show up to a meeting about this. I had 2 meetings about it, and, like, 2-3 people showed up each time. I kept trying to, like, organize, get, like, a caucus or a working group formed around it. I couldn't do it, so I just kind of, like, hung it up with DSA, and am doing my organizing elsewhere.
Give us your plugs,
you can
man.
Follow me on Twitter. It's just my name, Tarence, Tarence, Ray, Ray, and check us out We're the Trillbilly Workers Party on iTunes, Stitcher, all those places. So,
and Patreon. Go give them your $5 because they got fantastic content. Yeah, you guys had some really good interviews, like at the coal mining, where they're blocking the trains, and so that's a lot of like. There's not a lot of rural leftists, and there's certainly not a lot of rural leftists who keep themselves local. It's like it's incredible that you guys are like very localized in Kentucky and you talk Kentucky politics, but like Trillbillies is very accessible to everybody else. And I think that's what I really appreciate.
Thanks so much, guys, and thanks for having me on to let me rant for an hour.